All right, guys, I want to welcome everybody to our Nomberg Law Live, which is every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Central, 8 a.m. Pacific. We have interesting conversations with people in their areas of expertise. And I'm so thankful that we've been doing this show for about 4 years now, have had so many great guests, and that includes today. Birmingham attorney and friend Frank Osmond is my guest today. Frank, good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for having some time for us today. I think this is going to be an informative and nice conversation.
Glad to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Guys, I want to welcome, like it's my first day. No, Frank is an attorney here in Birmingham, like I said, and he does some really important work here. And it deals with prison reform, it deals with prisoner rights, and many other related things that not many lawyers do, and not enough eyeballs are on the issues that are at hand. So it takes people like Frank to bring these issues to the forefront. And sometimes it's not a popular topic. Sometimes it's one, in fact, people just wish would go away. But the reality is that prisoners have certain rights, even though they may be incarcerated. So, Frank, thank you for the work that you've been doing for so many years. I know you do other things as well. But before we jump into our meaty topics for today, tell folks a little bit more about yourself and your family.
Sure. I haven't really been doing the prisoner right work very long. I mean, that's really since kind of 2018 or so.
Mm-hmm.
Early in my career, I did some civil rights work defending local governments. And then as my career progressed, I kind of developed, would say, a specialty of sorts, a niche practice in advising banks and financial institutions about their obligations under civil rights laws, particularly the Equal Credit Opportunity Act and the Fair Housing Act.
Mm-hmm.
And in that kind of part of my practice, I got really comfortable dealing with um, large data sets. And so um, about 2017, 2018, there was a postdoc or maybe a doctoral candidate, I guess, at Columbia who got some publicity because he was trying to get some data from the Alabama Department of Corrections. And he was really struggling with that. And I knew some people who could help with that. And so I said, "Will you help this guy with this, trying to get his data together?" And they did that. And in the course of doing that, they not only put together what he wanted, but an enormous amount of data that was kind of the type stuff that I was accustomed to dealing with from a quantitative standpoint. So that's what really got me involved in the prison reform issue, and then I started getting cases on that as
Mm-hmm.
well. Um, and basically just looking at the data and saying, okay, what sort of observations can we draw from this? Ultimately, a woman named Donna Smalley asked me to write a letter to the governor's council on prison reform, outlining some of those observations. And it kind of took off from there.
Mm-hmm. And so, are you actively? I know that you have recently filed a lawsuit, matter of fact, this week, dealing with certain issues. But before we get into that, I guess, Frank, what are the prison reform issues that are of most importance the way you see it? What are those things that are really not being addressed either through public opinion or actual policies that are out there or laws? What's of importance these days?
Wow, that's a pretty long list.
Yeah.
No, I think the biggest one is the number of guards. Um, One of the first things that really hit me in looking at the data is that you know there's a big focus on overcrowding, and there is no denying that overcrowding is a horrible problem. I don't want to diminish that at all. But as we looked at the data over time, what we saw was that frequency and incidence of violence um, increased, um, but the population in the prison system was going down. So if overcrowding was causing
Hmm.
frequency of violence to increase, you would expect, to see something a little different. And what we saw was that, while for the years that the data was published, the level of violence was going up, the prison population was going down, but the number of guards was going down at an even quicker rate. Okay. So the the correctional officer to inmate in custody ratio is getting increasingly out of whack, right?
Hmm.
So one of the things that Commissioner Dunn has announced as a goal is hiring 2,200 new um, correctional officers by February 2022, and that's a goal that he announced, relative to the baseline in February. I'm sorry, December 2019.
Was this in response to a lawsuit or anything particular?
Well, there is a lawsuit in the Middle District, U.S. District Court for the Middle District of Alabama, which is in Montgomery. And that case is really about mental health, but in the course of that litigation, Judge Thompson made a couple of findings that, the number of correctional officers was just too low, and it's severely impacting not only mental health, but also some, some other aspects of the system unrelated to mental health. So yeah, that I think part of that, and he's acknowledged that in his annual report, is that they're under an order to increase the number of guards. I don't think they've had a lot of success with that yet, but that's a goal that they've announced. So that's an accurate, that's a worthy goal on their part to increase the number of correctional officers. So that's number one.
Hmm.
Number two, I think, there's some really serious problems with infrastructure in the system, and that's the piece that's getting all the attention.
Hmm.
I have a friend who has a child who's been in prison out west, and she put it to me, if I had a child in prison in Alabama, why would I not want prisons, right? Because the current facilities are horrible, right?
Hmm.
Or why would I not want renovated or less crowded systems? I think the challenge is that there's a big sentiment, and I think it's a well-founded sentiment, that if you build enormous prisons with incredible capacity, especially to the extent that you involve private industry, there becomes a big incentive to keep those prisons built. And so there's a lot of distrust among a lot of the activist community about the whole let's build new prisons undertaking.
Does,
So,
Frank, let me ask you on that line, does Alabama have any, what I'll call, this is my term, any modern prisons? Have any been built in the immediate past many years?
that's a great question, and I'll have to answer that by saying depends on how you count them. There's the Alabama Therapeutic Education Facility that's operated by GEO, which is a private corrections company. It's in Columbiana. That's relatively new and kind of spiffy. Beyond that, I don't know that there are any that you would say were contemporary. There's so many of them. They're like, 15, sort of custodial facilities, and then there are 11 what I would call loosely community correction type work camps.
So we have at least 25 incarceration facilities throughout the state.
That's right. I think it's 27, and for some reason that math isn't.
I had no idea we had that many, and I don't know if that's reflective on me or if I'm the average Joe not knowing that. Is that good or bad that we have that many, or do we need more, in your opinion?
One of the things that's nice about having a lot of facilities is that it gives inmates the opportunity, at least in theory, to be closer to their families.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as a practical matter, for whatever reason, the Department of Corrections transfers people around the system a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And so you see a lot of people who are located some distance from their families without any reason that's particularly compelling at least on the surface.
Mhm.
So yeah, that's part of it is the quality of the facilities. You know, do you need to renovate the current facilities? Do you need to um, build new facilities? I think the third piece that's not really getting much attention, that's kind of near and dear to my heart, having been around the financial industry a lot, is how are we paying for this?
Mhm.
You know, Alabama has some constitutional limitations on debt. Okay, I mean, and I defer to the bond lawyers. I can't really explain all that.
Right.
But
Right.
the bottom line is the state can't, you know, the state can't borrow money except through certain, you know, what you and I would call bond issues. I think what they call warrant issues.
Mhm.
We're taking on, according to what's been reported in the press, a very lengthy lease commitment that sounds an awful lot, you know, structurally like
Mhm.
a long-term debt facility. And, you know, what's that going to do to the state's credit rating? And then by credit rating, obviously states don't have like, you know, FICO scores, but, you know, they have Moody's and others
Right.
that follow them. And so
Right.
one of the anxieties I think a lot of people have is, you know, how is that going to impact the state's ability to pay for things down the road? And wouldn't it be more cost efficient to renovate current facilities?
And and that's
Obviously, not having a lot of public debate on that.
yeah. Yeah. Well, that's and these three issues. If I'm average Joe citizen, why did these things? If I don't have a family member in one of these facilities, if this is not on my radar screen, why would, if at all, average Joe citizen care about these things?
I think there are, you know, several reasons that I will divide into the secular and non-secular. um, in the secular category, I would say, you know, this thing about cost is going to impact quality of life down the road for a very long time.
Mhm.
And so if the state is operating under financial constraints that are imposed by some sort of imprudent terms and conditions on this deal, you're going to live with that for a long time. Or you're going to let a lot of people out of prison, which may be, you know, quite frankly, a judicial option. I mean, California has done that.
Well, that certainly right there
Yeah.
would get Joe citizens' attention when
Yeah.
they start putting in the press that a lot of folks are going to be let out of incarceration.
Well, and you know, I'm not saying that's currently on the radar, but ultimately,
Right.
if you know, we have a CRIPA lawsuit, a Civil Rights of Institutionalized Persons Act lawsuit
Mhm.
pending right now between US DOJ and the state of Alabama. And
Mhm.
ultimately, those things can result in what's called a three-judge court, and the court can start letting people out. I think
Mhm.
we're way away from that right now. I think that the challenge right now is just, you know, in terms of why do people care? Number one, you know, is this going to be a financially ruinous deal? Number two, you know, about 80% of the people who are in prison have self-reported problems with drug abuse,
Mhm.
okay, or addiction. And you know, you say, well, if I don't have a family member or if I don't have a friend who's in custody, well, you know what? You probably have family members or friends or acquaintances who have family members and friends who could be in custody
Mhm.
of just the prevalence of drug use. Um, and you know, that's something where, you know, it gets near and dear to people's hearts when it starts talking about their family members or their friends. I think that's a biggie. You know, when I was telling you about the woman who has the child who was in prison out west, I mean, that woman is the former CEO of two hospitals.
Mhm.
Okay, so it's not just other people that it happens to.
Yeah.
And I think it's, you know, it's just a real trigger. You know, from the non-secular reasons, you know, you read Isaiah, you read you read others of the prophets, and they're very plain spoken about paying attention to the plight of prisoners,
Mm-hmm.
People who are unfortunate,
Mm-hmm.
people who are suffering. And if you know about that and it's within your ability to do something and you don't do something, then that's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a big, compelling reason.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Guys, we're talking with Birmingham attorney Frank Osmond. We're talking about prison reform, and Frank is just giving us an overview of some of the issues, not all of the issues, there's certainly many, but some of the issues as he sees them as current problems in the prison system. And Frank, let me ask you, let's step back from Alabama. Do you have an opinion or have you made an observation? How does our state compare to other states, either in the South or around the country, when it comes to these issues that you're bringing up?
Great question. There's certainly some states that are doing things that are very proactive and that seem to be working,
Mm-hmm.
that we're not doing. And one is Rhode Island, for
Mm-hmm.
instance. Rhode Island, a big problem with prisons is people who are addicted to opioids.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and so number one, that substance use disorder results in them either going to prison because of basically glorified possession charges or sometimes distribution charges. Sometimes that disorder will lead them to commit other crimes that cause them to be in
Mm-hmm.
prison. Once they get there, guess what? They're drugs in prison. Okay. We'll leave aside how those drugs get there, but they're there.
Right.
And so, how do you help people who are in prison who want to overcome that disorder?
Mm-hmm.
Well, if they were in the free world, we know that the most effective way for many of those people to overcome the problem is what's called medicine-assisted therapy and drug counseling. Okay, so if you were in the free world and you were addicted to opioids, you were addicted to heroin or oxycodone or whatever it is, you would break that addiction, probably using medicine-assisted therapy, which would involve you taking something like Suboxone, Sublocade,
Mm-hmm.
Vivitrol, you name it. And then you would need counseling. And it takes probably a couple of years for that to happen. Well, you look at a state like Rhode Island, they have MAT, medicine-assisted therapy, and counseling for prisoners who are actually in the prison system. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
And it has been very effective. And if you talk to the warden up there, she said, look, I'm an old school CO, started at the ground level. They came to me and said, let's do MAT and drug therapy in prison. I said, no way. She said, now I'm a big advocate of it because it worked and it really has been very effective. We're not doing much like that. We have a couple of programs, for people in custody. There are challenges with those programs. I don't know that they're designed even to manage effective long-term problems. One of the things that we have going on is, which I'm helping a guy named Rod Graham with, is an adversary proceeding in the Purdue Pharma bankruptcy,
Mm-hmm.
where we're asking the bankruptcy court, please, set aside some money to subsidize drug counseling for those prisoners who can't have MAT and who are in custody. Obviously, they've had difficulty filing claims in that bankruptcy.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe something will come out on that. The other thing is education. Men in Alabama who have access to education sometimes get a pretty doggone good education.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a reentry program here in Birmingham called Shepherd's Fold Ministries. You go out there, you talk to those guys. A lot of them have great, real world work skills, carpentry, electricity, or electrician, etc. A lot of them don't. I mean, I'm not saying that everybody does, but there is some opportunity for some people there. In contrast, if you looked at what's available to the women, it's not good. It's just not the same level. And as a result, when they get out and they go into a supervised release program, I think it's very difficult to employ those women. One of the things that's going on, there's a guy named Franklin Pate who is the lead trustee for Knoxville College. Knoxville is the Presbyterian HBCU for Tennessee, the alma mater of Joseph Lowry and a lot of other people. They now provide online education for prisoners in East Tennessee, and I think also in West Tennessee. And they have a curriculum very focused on it. Go ahead.
What percentage, if you know, of those eligible for that education actually take part in it? Is it a decent percentage?
In terms of Alabama, the people who are eligible for the education and who take part in it, I think you have to break that down into two questions.
Mm-hmm.
Right? One is what percentage, to what percentage is that educational opportunity offered,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then among those to whom it's offered, how many take advantage of it?
Right.
Okay? So I think it's a very low percentage of, prisoners have that opportunity offered to them. Okay. Whereas, among those that have the opportunity, I think it's a very high percentage of participation. One of the things depends on the level of custody, depends on the
Sure.
There's a lot of mental illness in prisons, obstruct a lot of this. But whereas in Tennessee, I don't know. I mean, I'd have to defer to Franklin, who lives here in Birmingham, on the numbers there. But I think they've gotten a really great reception to that program.
Let me pause you. Go back talking about the opioid issue. One of the things that in my world, in the work comp world, Social Security disability world, it's long been known, and you probably know this as well, there are pockets of our state that have some of the highest percentages of opioid abuse in the country.
Right.
In fact, I think one or two counties may even lead the country per capita.
Right.
So I'm sure none of that is helpful at all, quite hurtful to the issues that you're dealing with about the addiction and how prisoners are just not able to shake free. But along those same lines, I had a question when you were mentioning Rhode Island and the program that they have, the MAT. Do you think, maybe you've heard of this, I don't know, it just kind of struck me, kind of like I've read in the past where people who owe large debts to the mafia or to bad guys will intentionally get themselves thrown into jail or prison in hopes that that's a safe haven for them. But my question to you is, do you think that there are prisoners, say in Rhode Island, who know of this program, who want to get the help, may do something to intentionally get themselves incarcerated, so it might make them eligible for that MAT, the medical assistance treatment? Does that make sense? I
guess the question is, would people, commit a crime in order to take advantage of MAT or counseling in order to, overcome their problems?
Mm-hmm.
And, would they do that in Rhode Island? I don't know. Nobody in their right mind would do that.
Yeah, I didn't think that would be
that would not
something to consider here.
I will say, there is a, you're going back to the percentages of incarceration and opioid use disorder. One of the things that we looked at, some of the counties, well, the counties that comprise the 4th Congressional District,
Mm-hmm.
okay, which is Robert Adderhold's district,
Mm-hmm.
Think about that. It kind of runs east to west,
Mm-hmm.
kind of across the
Mm-hmm.
kind of bottom half of the northern third of the state. Walker, northern Tuscaloosa, Etowah.
Mm-hmm.
That um, that district, together with the fourth district, which is really around Mobile, had the highest per capita opioid prescription rate of any congressional district, any two congressional districts in the country. And it's enormous. A lot of it, of course, is concentrated in one, right?
Right.
But what's fascinating about it is the fourth congressional district. So those two are really about neck and neck in terms of per capita opioid prescription rates.
Mm-hmm.
Um, what's interesting about it is the fourth district incarcerates people at roughly twice the rate as the first district.
Wow.
Yeah. So I think these things are kind of complicated, in terms of
Mm-hmm.
um, what's the cause and effect of this stuff.
Yeah. Well,
So
this.
I don't know how I got off on that tangent.
No, it's all of this, and it just shows to the bigger issue here. Obviously, in 30 minutes, we can't cover nearly as much as should be covered. We're just hitting some highlights, if you will, with Birmingham attorney Frank Osmond. Frank, before we get you out of here, and we've got a couple of minutes left, and I sure appreciate you sharing your insight. Let's talk about the lawsuit that you filed this week. Tell us a little bit about it and why it's an important case that needs to be known about.
Well, when I said I was going to do this show with you, I did not know I was going to file it.
Mm-hmm.
And but basically, it's a lawsuit brought on behalf of a prisoner against the governor, the board of pardons and paroles,
Mm-hmm.
and the Bureau of Pardons and Paroles and others. And basically, the problem, is that we have a constitutional amendment that says pardons and paroles is a function that belongs to the legislature.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And that's been around a long time. And we also in Alabama have a totally over the top, you know, separation of powers clause. I mean, it's section 43, I think 42. Read it. I mean, it really gills the lily. Okay. Well, in 2019, the Alabama legislature gave the governor the right to appoint the director of the Bureau of Pardons and Paroles. So in other words, the legislature purported to give the governor, a big piece of the whole governance of pardons and paroles. And so this lawsuit is saying, look, that violates a separation of powers clause. And it's not a purely technical issue because since that happened, right, things have not been very productive for the Board of Pardons and Paroles. And that may not be the fault of the board members. I mean, they may, they may be somebody else's fault.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing that the lawsuit challenges is Governor Ivey's proclamation basically prohibiting the board from having public meetings. You can't grant parole except in a public meeting, right? And so if you have this proclamation that all but eliminates the possibility of having a public meeting, that doesn't look bad. It doesn't look good, and it looks especially bad when it has the effect of inflating the prison population while we're having these negotiations over how big should our new prisons be, right?
Right. It seems like things are being done with doors being closed, and not enough people know about not enough things that are being considered or going on. And then then it's too late because then decisions have been made. Is that, I know that's a terrible way to look at it, but is that kind of fair?
But I'm the ultimate retail thinker. I have no big concepts and no big ideas. Okay. And to me, this is about one woman.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And it is a woman who I think if the Board of Pardons and Paroles had been able to have a public meeting, had really been functioning, well with their own director, et cetera, and so forth. By the way, the director was in place then at the time for applications, not the same guys there now. But if the whole thing had been operating well, I think there's no doubt that they would have given a really hard look and serious consideration to giving this woman parole. I mean, she's been an exemplary prisoner for decades. I mean, she had letters of support from the state. It does have bigger policy issues. It does kind of have other big policy implications, perhaps. And I'll let the big policy people kind of sort all that. It's not me.
Well, Frank, I hope you keep filing these lawsuits. I hope you keep getting people's attention and making a difference for those who need it. So thank you for sharing a little bit about prison reform and what's going on in the state of Alabama these days. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And guys, we try to bring you conversations with people in their areas of expertise. And Frank certainly fits that bill. And I'm proud to call him friend. And I'm so glad he had some time for us today. As we do each Tuesday, 10 a.m. Central, 8 a.m. Pacific, for about 30 minutes or so, Nomberg Law Live. And we'll come back to you again next week. Hope you guys have a safe week. Take care.
Thanks, bud.